So power, desire, and happiness are all related to each other. Hobbes basically believed that there were two things within man that pulled at him: appetite, the desire to get good things, and aversion, the desire to avoid bad things. These things both led to happiness. And happiness, he said, was not the satisfaction of all desires, but the continued success of satisfying the desires you had. So it's not that you get everything you want, but that you continually are being satisfied. All right? Not to your maximum level, but that you have a relatively good aspect, or I guess you could say good quantity of satisfaction in your life. So then how is power related to happiness? Well, in order to get those desires, or to avoid those things that you want to avoid, right, as he called it, aversion, you need power to do that. So power is the means to acquire what you desire, or the means to avoid what you don't want. Excuse me. So power is the ability to gain those goals. So man is constantly pushed and pulled between this desire and this aversion. He was very influenced by Aristotle here. Aristotle said that men gravitate to each other and that government happens because of this. The government is natural. It naturally happens as a result of this. And this is something that Hobbes agreed with, and that because man needed power and he was more powerful in groups, this is what led to government. You can kind of see why he doesn't really have a problem with a ruler who is all-powerful. Because if that ruler is all-powerful and he's defending his people, in some way the people are achieving happiness. It doesn't really work out in practice, as you can see from almost any despotism in the world and in history, but this was his view. But contrast this with the biblical view of government. Does man naturally gravitate towards government? We see with the Tower of Babel that man definitely has an innate desire to cooperate with one another. But what type of government does man usually form on his own without the influence of God? We'll talk about that in class. Moving on, the overall view of government that Hobbes had was something that was very interesting. And as we've said before, it was all about power and gaining power. But he also believed that there were two cardinal virtues that the government could use. Those two cardinal virtues were force and fraud. Okay? If you wanted something, you were going to get it either by force or by fraud. Basically, he did believe in property rights, but the only property rights he believed in were you have what you can get and keep. Now, you may be thinking, wait, that doesn't line up with an all-powerful government idea. Let me establish some differences really quickly. So Hobbes, just like John Locke, believed in something called the state of nature. The state of nature is basically a system in which man is free from government. Now, this was not Hobbes' preference. He thought that government was better. But he acknowledged, just like John Locke, that for some, they existed, or before governments were formed, that there existed those in a state of nature. So in a state of nature, he said fraud and force were okay. That basically, you used whatever you could to get what you could and keep it. And that this was personal property rights. We call this might makes right. Now, once government is formed, he said, well, that is taken away. Okay? So, interestingly, John Locke thought that the state of nature was essentially peaceful, whereas Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is essentially chaotic and violent, that man has a tendency to fight with one another. And John Locke said, well, no, man has the tendency to be essentially peaceful without government. Now, John Locke was not an anarchist. He's not saying no government. But in general, he's saying the less government there is, that man will be essentially peaceful, that he'll be guided by reason. What do you think about that? Do you agree with Hobbes' view that in a state of nature, without really a constructive government, that people are naturally chaotic and violent? Or do you agree with John Locke that people are actually more, I guess you could say, reasonable and less likely to harm each other in a state of nature? We'll talk about that in class. Hobbes' view of nature, of human nature and war. Well, you might have already figured out that war is something that is very necessary in Hobbes' view, especially in something that is not, or especially in a state of nature. It's just going to happen. But then also remember, a sovereign's primary purpose is to prevent his country from being taken. So war is something that is simply a part of human life to Hobbes. And then what about Hobbes' view of human nature? Well, we need to establish some differences between his view and John Locke's view. So Hobbes believed that liberty was that each man had to use, or had the ability to use his own power. That a right is the liberty to do something. Listen to that again. A right is the liberty to do something. Liberty was the absence of external impediments. Okay, so for Hobbes, liberty and government are not able to exist at the same time. This is something very different from John Locke's view, okay? But to get back to the point, Hobbes basically said we need to abandon nature in order for the preservation of civil society. That without government, man will just basically become chaotic and attack each other, and it's going to be like cavemen or something. This is something that John Locke did not believe, but you can kind of see where Hobbes is going based on his premise. He's saying that because man is violent on his own, you have to have this civil government. But the only problem that I think Hobbes isn't thinking about is who is the head of that government anyway? We'll talk about that in class as well. But now let's talk very briefly about John Locke's view. So John Locke's view of the social contract, not the social network, of the social contract was that man had natural rights and that the individuals would obey the laws of the government as long as the government protected those rights. Hobbes, however, said, no, once man joins a social contract, he has no rights. So this is a very big difference. Hobbes says, when you join the social contract, when you join a country, when you join a government, your rights are gone. You've given those up to the sovereign. You don't even have the right of revolution. There's not really even a contract to Hobbes because the ruler, the sovereign, can change the contract at any time he desires. Whereas with John Locke, he says, no, the natural rights of man are to be preserved by the government, and when they are not preserved, the people have a right to rebellion. Which of these do you think our founding fathers went with? I'll leave that up to you, and we'll talk about it in class. Hobbes also had a very strange view of fear. This goes in the human nature category still. He said that fear was a good motivator that caused people to leave their natural rights behind. That because man is chaotic without government, that people would naturally flock to government because they were afraid of the violence that occurs without government, according to Hobbes again. And this is something that is a little strange, and I think he's got some good points because, again, we believe that man's nature is essentially sinful. But we'll talk about kind of the best ways to restrict man's sinful nature in class this week. So what was his view of nature and justice? Well, he said justice was the constant will of giving to every man his own, or the constant act of giving everybody what they deserve. Now, who decides what everybody deserves? The sovereign, of course. So the sovereign is something that is all-powerful and cannot be really broken, except in that one case that we talked about in which he cannot defend the people. He said the right to self-defense is the only inalienable right, that all your other rights can be taken away because of this quote-unquote social contract, but that you always have the right to self-defense. This was something that Hobbes said was inalienable. An inalienable right is a right that cannot be taken away no matter the cause. John Locke believed that there were many inalienable rights, whereas Hobbes is saying there's only one, at least once you are out of that state of nature. Okay? And so let's continue on to the very last part here, actor, author, and authority. So basically, there's three parts to government according to Hobbes. There's the actor, the sovereign. There's the author, the individuals, those who have formed the social contract together, and the authority. Okay? Well, the actor possesses the authority. So even though the authors are the people, the sovereign can change the book, the play, at any time he chooses. He can escape any consequences because the people have given up their rights to the sovereign, according to Hobbes. Now, this was something that you would think would not be very popular with Parliament, except because Hobbes said that you should never rebel against the government unless the government could not defend you. This was actually very popular with Parliament, especially when, after the English Civil War, they removed the king, because this meant, according to Hobbes, nobody should rebel against Parliament. So he actually ended up returning back to England later on in life, and I think he thought he was a lot more popular than he really was, but Parliament was okay with him, because he said, hey, you guys are the actors, and you have the authority. People should obey you, and nobody should rebel you and try to replace you with a king. Now, of course, they were replaced with a king, Charles II, and that did not go so well, as you might remember from your history books. So thanks for watching this, guys. I know this Hobbes is a little confusing, but I think the main ideas you need to get from this are that he was a very influential political writer that would influence not so much the people of the time, but especially people that came along later, people like Hegel, people like Karl Marx. It's very interesting to see how his influence really doesn't crop up immediately, but about 100 years or 150 years after his death. This is the case with a lot of people that we're going to be looking at. So I want you to think, okay, what are the similarities between him and Machiavelli? What are the differences? And how do you think this influenced the people during his lifetime and then later in his life? We'll talk more about John Locke later on. Thanks. Bye.